The Duke of Stirling arrived at the gates of Blackwood Manor, under a sky the colour of a bruised plum. It was a sky that had not decided whether to weep or simply to weigh upon the earth. Arthur Stirling was a man who carried the salt of the Western Ocean in the very fibres of his heavy wool coat. He was a man whose presence usually demanded the opening of windows and the clearing of lungs. But as he stepped across the threshold of the Blackwood estate, he felt the air thicken and stall. It was a house that was not merely quiet. It was a house that was holding its breath. It felt like a stone mausoleum, where the living moved like ghosts through a world of velvet and dust. He noted with a scrupulous eye that the drive was overgrown with weeds that choked the gravel. The ivy on the walls looked less like decoration and more like a slow green strangulation. He was met at the door not by a boisterous butler or a hurried footman, but by a servant who moved in absolute eerie silence. The man wore felt slippers that swallowed the sound of his footsteps upon the marble floor. This was a detail that sent a flicker of irritation through Arthur. In his world of shipyards and coastal winds, noise was a sign of life, of industry, and of health. Here, the silence was curated, a deliberate architecture of suppression. As he was led toward the drawing room, Arthur paused in the hallway. His gaze was arrested by an object that seemed utterly out of place in a home of such supposed refinement. A grand gilded mirror hung upon the wall, but its reflective surface was entirely obscured by a heavy shroud of black silk cloths. Arthur reached out a calloused hand, his fingers brushing the fabric. It was not the light, airy crepe of a funeral veil. It was a dense, suffocating weave that felt like a weight against the wall. He looked down the gallery and realized with a mounting sense of unease that every mirror and every polished silver tray was similarly draped. It was as if the house were in mourning, yet the master of the manor was not dead. Julian Blackwood appeared then at the end of the hall. His silhouette was sharp and polished. He was a man who wore his grief like a perfectly tailored coat. He did not offer a hand in greeting, but instead performed a shallow, elegant bow that felt like a barrier rather than an invitation. Arthur Stirling preferred the bluntness of a captain's log to the winding paths of aristocratic conversation. He tapped the maritime debt ledger tucked beneath his arm. The heavy leather binding was a solid weight against his ribs. "I have come to discuss the matter of your father's outstanding obligations to the Stirling fleet," Arthur stated. His tone was resonant and deep, a sound that seemed to make the heavy drapes shiver in protest. "It is a debt that has sat upon my books for too long, Lord Julian. I find that numbers are the only honest rooms in the world, and yours are currently quite crowded with arrears." Julian Blackwood smiled, a thin, brittle expression that did not reach his eyes. His eyes were the color of cold tea, stagnant and unmoving. "My apologies, Duke, for the atmosphere of my home," Julian replied. His voice was a practiced whisper that demanded Arthur lean in to hear. "Since the unfortunate decline of my sister's health, we have found it necessary to maintain a certain stillness. Elara is constitutionally unable to bear the rigors of a standard household. The mirrors are a precaution. Dr. Thorne has advised us that the sight of her own reflection causes her a most violent nervous agitation. She believes herself to be shattering, and the glass confirms the delusion. We cover them out of love to preserve the fragments of her mind." Arthur felt a cold prickle of skepticism. He had seen men broken by the sea, minds unmoored by the vast blue, but they were never healed by silence and shrouds. They were healed by the sun on their faces and the work of their hands. The idea of a woman being kept in a house of shadows because she feared her own face felt like a lie that had been left to rot. He looked at Julian and noted the expensive silk of the man's cravat and the meticulous shine of his boots. These details contrasted sharply with the neglected state of the manor's exterior. It seemed that Julian Blackwood was quite comfortable in his grief, provided it was funded by the erasure of his sister. "I should like to see her," the Duke warned, his tone low and dangerous. "If I am to settle these debts, I must understand the full state of the Blackwood interest. Lady Elara is a co-heir to the maritime shares, is she not? Her signature, or at least my personal observation of her incapacity, is required for the legal transfer." Julian's posture stiffened. This was a minute hardening of the shoulders that Arthur caught immediately. He had seen that same look on the faces of smugglers when the revenue cutters were spotted on the horizon. It was the look of a man whose cargo was not what he claimed it to be. The east wing of Blackwood Manor was a place where time had been ordered to stand still. As Arthur followed Julian up the stairs, he noticed that the clocks on the mantels had all been stopped. Their brass pendulums were frozen in mid-swing. The air here was even heavier. It smelled of lavender and old wax, a scent that tried and failed to mask the underlying odor of a room that never saw the sun. Julian paused before a set of heavy mahogany doors, his hand lingering on the latch. "I must warn you, Stirling. She is but a shadow of the girl you might remember from years ago. Do not expect words. She has found that the world is too loud for speech." When the doors opened, Arthur had to squint against the gloom. The windows were not only shuttered, but covered with heavy velvet hangings. They allowed only the thinnest sliver of grey light to bleed into the room. In the center of this artificial twilight sat a woman. Elara Blackwood was draped in a gown of pale muslin that made her seem almost transparent against the dark upholstery. Her hair was once described as a vibrant, living chestnut. Now it was a dull brown, pulled back so tightly from her face that it seemed to strain the skin of her temples. She did not look up when they entered. Her gaze was fixed upon a spot on the floor. Her fingers moved in a rhythmic, frantic motion against her skirt, as if she were counting invisible threads. Arthur stepped forward, his boots sounding like thunderclaps in the stifling quiet. "Lady Elara," he said, softening his voice but refusing to whisper. The woman flinched, a violent tremor that caused her to draw her arms inward. She looked like a creature that had been hunted into a corner and had finally realized there was no escape. She did not speak. Instead, she let out a long, shuddering breath that was almost a whistle. It was a sound of profound and weary terror. Julian moved to her side with practiced ease. His hand came down upon her shoulder in a gesture that looked like comfort but functioned like a tether. "You see, Duke," Julian said, his voice dripping with a sickly and condescending pity, "the light of the doorway is already too much for her. She is a bird with broken wings, and I am merely the cage that keeps the danger away." Arthur did not answer. He was looking at Elara's hands. Despite the trembling, her fingers were stained with ink. It was a deep, permanent violet that spoke of long hours spent with the pen. He glanced around the room and saw no books, no paper, and no writing desk. The room was a void, a place designed to hold nothing but the person within it. Arthur Sterling leaned down, placing himself in Elara's line of sight. He was forcing her to see him. He did not see madness in her eyes. Instead, he saw a desperate and flickering intelligence that was being drowned in a sea of grey. It was the look of a sailor lost at sea, watching the last light of the lighthouse fade into the mist. He smelled the bergamot of his own soap and the sharp, clean scent of the ocean air clinging to his coat. He saw Elara's nostrils flare. Her chest was heaving as she took in a scent that was not lavender or dust. For a fleeting second, her eyes met his. In that moment, Arthur saw the architecture of a soul that had been dismantled brick by brick. She leaned toward him, her lips parting as if to catch the very air he brought with him. A whisper escaped her that was so faint it was barely a vibration. "Too bright," she murmured. Her ink-stained fingers twitched toward the lapel of his coat. It was not a gesture of fear, but of a starving person reaching for a crumb. Julian immediately tightened his grip on her shoulder. She recoiled as if burned. Her spine snapped back against the chair, and the shutters of her mind slammed closed once more. She returned to her silent counting. Her eyes were wide and vacant. The lie of her illness settled over her like a shroud. Arthur stood up, his heart hammering against his ribs with a sudden and violent indignation. He had come to Blackwood Manor to settle a debt of silver and gold. He realized now that he was standing in the presence of a far more terrible theft. Julian Blackwood was not protecting his sister. He was consuming her. He was using the language of medicine and the sanctuary of the home to build a prison that had no bars. It had only shadows and black silk cloths. The Duke looked at Julian, who stood there looking so scrupulously concerned and so constitutionally proper. He felt a wave of maritime fury that he had to fight to keep from his face. "This environment is a poison, Julian," Arthur declared. His deep timbre physically pushed back the encroaching gloom. "You say she cannot bear the world, but I say the world is the only thing that can save her. You have stopped the clocks and covered the mirrors, and you wonder why she has forgotten how to live. A sorrow wearing a man's coat is still a sorrow, and you have dressed this entire house in it." Julian's eyes narrowed. The mask of the grieving brother slipped for a fraction of a second to reveal a cold and calculating predator. "And what would you suggest, Sterling? That we throw her into the street? That we subject her to the mockery of a society that has already forgotten her name?" Arthur Sterling did not hesitate. He thought of his coastal estate, where the wind roared off the great sea, and the shipbuilders shouted over the sound of hammers. He thought of a place where the sun hit the water with a brilliance that could blind a man who was not prepared for the truth. He thought of Mrs. Halloway and the warmth of a kitchen that smelled of bread and honest labor. "I suggest that she needs a house that breathes," Arthur declared. He looked down at Elara, who was still counting her invisible threads. She was unaware that the world had just walked into her room. "I have a legal right to this estate's management until the debt is solvent. As a primary creditor, I have the standing to challenge this wardship." But Arthur knew the courts were slow, and Elara was fading now. Her very skin seemed to turn to ash in the darkness. He did not need a judge, he needed a ship. He turned to Julian, his spine as straight as a mast in a gale. "I find the stagnant air of this manor does not agree with my constitution. I suspect it agrees with Lady Elara's even less. I am invoking the wardship clause of the original maritime charter. It is a document your father signed when he was a man of vision, not a jailer." "I am taking her home," Arthur murmured, his pledge a solemn vow. He was unaware of the depths of the psychological fortress he was about to storm. He only knew that the silence in this room had teeth, and he was determined to pull them. He was taking a woman who had been trained to believe that his very touch would shatter her into 1,000 pieces. But he would not leave her to the shadows any longer. Julian Blackwood's face turned the color of aged parchment, absorbing the meager light. He did not shout. Men like Julian found power in the meticulous control of silence, a silence that in this shuttered house had teeth. He smoothed his charcoal waistcoat, his eyes darting toward the heavy mahogany doors as if summoning the shadows to defend his borders. The air in the room was thick with unburned wax, stale lavender, and the oppressive weight of a home that had deliberately ceased to breathe. "This is an outrage," Julian whispered, the sound like a dead autumn leaf. "You are a sailor who has forgotten the manners of the land, Arthur. My sister, Elara, is a ward of this house under the supervision of a licensed man of science. You cannot simply walk in and claim her as though she were a crate of traded spices." Arthur Sterling did not move. He stood in the center of the stifling room, a towering pillar of iron and salt air, holding the maritime debt ledger like a weapon. Its pages were heavy with ink and obligation. Arthur traced a calloused thumb over the binding. He found the stench of this room, the stale lavender, the cloying smell of a soul being extinguished, to be a personal affront. Arthur had worn his grief like weather for 7 years, but the sight of this deliberate decay sparked a sudden violent thaw of fury within his chest. "Numbers do not lie about them," Arthur noted, his words cutting through the dimness. "The original charter is exquisitely specific. In cases of profound insolvency, the primary creditor possesses the right to assume the stewardship of all shared assets. Your father listed Elara's dowry and her portion of the estate as collateral. The debt is absolute. This ledger has survived typhoons and the bloody campaigns of the Peninsular War. It demands balance. A family cannot survive on false bookkeeping." Julian's pale eyes widened with genuine fear. He took a stumbling step backward. "You would use an archaic business contract to steal a defenseless woman from her sickbed?" "It is not a sickbed if the patient is being deliberately buried in the dark," Arthur countered, his grey eyes flashing. "A ledger is the one honest room in the world, Julian, and yours is heavily overdrawn. You have kept her in the shadows to control her portion of the estate, paying for your lavish London seasons with the currency of her isolation." The heavy door opened with an oily click as Silas Thorne entered. Constructed of soft angles, he wore a coat of black wool that absorbed the light. He carried a battered leather bag that smelled of ether and cloves. Dr. Thorne studied the Duke with the detached curiosity of a man examining a dangerous specimen. "Lord Julian," Dr. Thorne said, his baritone designed to lull the senses. "Lady Elara's constitution is a fragile glass bridge. To subject her to the violent stimuli of the outside world would be an act of psychological ruin. Her mind will fracture." Arthur felt a towering wave of icy indignation. Dr. Thorne was not a man of healing. He was the primary architect of this grand mausoleum, providing the intellectual scaffolding for Julian's lies. He wrote prescriptions for chains and called it therapy. "Your stasis, doctor, looks remarkably like a prison," Arthur said, forcing the physician to retreat a step. "I have seen the deep purple ink marks on Elara's fingers. She is starving for the light, and I am constitutionally incapable of leaving her to languish." He produced a folded piece of thick vellum. It was the wardship clause, signed and stamped by the High Court of Admiralty. "This document gives me absolute legal authority to relocate the ward of the Blackwood interest to a place of my choosing. I choose Sterling House. I choose the salt air and the honest noise of the working world." Julian's bloodless lips twisted into a sneer. "You think you are saving her, Arthur? She has been meticulously taught that the sun is a roaring flame that will consume her. You are taking a terrified ghost into a shipyard. You will be left with nothing but fine dust." "I am taking her home," the Duke said, unaware she was a prisoner in her own house, assuming merely that she was the victim of overzealous medical confinement. He did not yet comprehend the sprawling labyrinth of psychological torment she had endured. Arthur turned his back on the two men and strode to the corner where Elara sat motionless. He leaned down, his movements surprisingly gentle, and scooped her up into his arms. She was horrifyingly light. Elara let out a small gasp of terror and buried her face deep in the thick, bergamot-scented wool of his maritime coat. She smelled of settling dust and unlived years. His heavy boots struck the floorboards with a defiant thunder. He did not cast a glance back, walking purposefully through the eastern chambers as a living intrusion in a dead world. They reached the landing of the grand staircase, and Arthur saw the full extent of Julian's malice. The massive mirrors lining the descent were entirely draped in black silk cloths. It was a funereal sight, transforming the corridor into a procession of faceless shapes hiding the honest truth of reflections. Julian had claimed her reflection would shatter her mind, a lie that altered the architecture of the home. Elara's eyes were squeezed shut against his lapel, her violet ink stains highlighting her desperate grip. She murmured an endless string of prime numbers, a fragmented mathematical prayer to keep the walls from collapsing. Arthur felt a rising surge of maritime fury. He wanted to rip the black silk cloth down, but he kept his pace steady. The manor was caught in a suspended, stifling pause. He would not falter. He was the only solid thing in her dissolving world. The natural light spilling from the open double doors was merely pale grey to Arthur, but for Elara it was a blinding force. As they approached the threshold, she began to struggle, possessing the frantic movement of a delicate creature thrown into a furnace. "No," Elara whispered, the word tearing in her throat. "Too much, the world. It will break me. Julian says the air has teeth." Arthur tightened his hold, he instructed, his cadence a low rumble near her ear that felt like a ship's anchor. "The air has no teeth, Elara. It will not break you. An account book provides unassailable truth, and by my careful tally, you are owed a lifetime of breathing." But as they stepped onto the gravel drive, her psychological fortress collapsed. The sky appeared to her frightened mind as a screaming expanse of crushing space. The damp chill clung to her face. To Arthur, it was the bracing touch of autumn. For Elara, it was a terrifying violation. She let out a thin whistle of sensory overload, going rigidly stiff in his arms as her dilated pupils fixed on the vault above. The rustling weeds, the harsh caw of a rook, and the waiting carriage were a deafening torrent of impressions for a mind trained to exist in absolute silence. The world was too loud, too bright, too vast. Arthur realized he had drastically underestimated the damage Julian had wrought. He had foolishly thought of her prison as a physical room of stone. He saw clearly now that the true prison was built of insidious thoughts, a dark labyrinth she was forced to carry inside her own mind. He took a measured step backward, retreating into the shadow of the portico to shield her from the open sky. "Breathe," Arthur commanded, his voice iron-hard but thrumming with kindness. "Keep your eyes on the face of the man who is holding you, Elara. Do not stare at the sky. Focus on me." His cool grey eyes served as the single anchor in her violently spinning world. He knew intimately what it was to be desperately lost in a screaming gale of the mind, and he would not let her drown in hers. The heavy iron manor gates stood at the far end of the drive. In Elara's view, those towering gates were the absolute edge of the habitable world. But as Arthur held her, he saw her fingers marked by those vivid ink stains, stubbornly curling into the rough fabric of his coat. She was terrified, yet her buried intellect still knew how to fight for a place in the physical world. "We are going through those iron gates," Arthur said, his tone low but carrying a solemn vow. "And when we do, the sun will not burn your skin. You will still be Elara Blackwood, and you will be gloriously alive." He placed her on the velvet squabs of the carriage interior, pulling the heavy leather window blinds down to shut out the moors. The enclosed space smelled of polished wood, horsehair, and the enduring scent of bergamot. It was a temporary container for her frantic spirit, but for the overwhelmed woman, it felt as though she were being hurtled through a void at terrifying speed. The carriage lurched forward. Elara flinched violently, pulling her knees to her chest. She dug her fingers into the velvet upholstery, seeking mathematical certainty in the sway of the cabin. Arthur took the seat opposite her. He understood the architecture of a panicked mind, bracing his heavy boots against the floorboards, presenting an image of absolute stability. "The wheels will rattle," Arthur said quietly, nodding toward the dimness. "The carriage will sway. It is merely the arithmetic of motion over uneven ground. You are safe. I have balanced the ledger of this journey, and it ends in sanctuary." Hours bled into the fading afternoon. The road was a punishing progression of deep ruts and loose stones. The rhythmic sway became a grueling endurance test. Each revolution of the wheel seemed to grind against her frayed nerves. Arthur watched her in silence, his heart aching. He had commanded ships through the most violent tempests, yet he had never seen a storm as devastating as the one raging behind Elara's shut eyes. With every severe jolt, Elara sat rigid, half expecting the chaotic outside world to finally reach in and break her fragile spirit, exactly as Julian had promised. Her breathing remained shallow, her eyes fixed on the scuffed leather of Arthur's boots, as if they were the only two solid objects in a disintegrating universe. Yet, the sturdy wooden walls held fast. The man sitting across from her did not panic, did not speak down to her, and did not demand she conquer her fear instantly. He simply remained there, offering his quiet presence as a shield against her terror. As dusk began to settle, painting the edges of the drawn blinds in a bruised purple light, the carriage slowed. The sudden cessation of rapid movement was almost as jarring as its beginning. She let out a ragged breath, her dilated eyes darting toward the heavy door. The sounds of the inn courtyard bled through the leather blinds, the gruff shouts of ostlers, the clatter of a stable bucket. For Elara, it was a deafening symphony of chaos. The outside world was pressing in, threatening to breach the frail wooden walls of their sanctuary. "We are halting for the night," Arthur announced, his tone leaving absolutely no room for panic. "It is an inn on the northern road, a respectable establishment. You will have a private room, a warm fire, and a locked door to keep the world at bay." He watched her trembling form, realizing with a sudden cold clarity that the true battle was only just beginning. He had successfully torn her from the suffocating grip of Blackwood Manor, but she was still carrying the heavy iron bars of her psychological prison inside her own mind. The roadside inn awaited them, a sprawling, noisy structure filled with strangers, unpredictable sounds, and inevitably uncovered mirrors. Arthur braced himself as the carriage came to a full stop. He was taking her home, but they would first have to survive the terrifying, unmapped territory of the world in between. The iron-rimmed wheels of the carriage finally ceased their rhythmic grinding against the North Road gravel, and the sudden silence that followed felt like a physical weight. Arthur Sterling sat in the dim interior of the cabin, his gaze fixed on Elara Blackwood. She remained huddled against the far corner of the velvet squabs, her breath coming in shallow, ragged hitches that spoke of a soul still trapped in the airless rooms of Blackwood Manor. Outside, the world of the roadside inn was a cacophony of life. The rough shouts of ostlers unhitching teams, the metallic clatter of buckets, and the smell of wood smoke and roasting mutton. To Arthur, these were the sounds of an honest evening. To Elara, they were the encroaching teeth of a monster she had been taught to fear for 3 years. The Duke stepped out first, his heavy boots striking the damp earth with a sound of absolute authority. He did not wait for the innkeeper to offer a greeting. He moved with the scrupulous efficiency of a man who had commanded fleets through the worst gales of the Atlantic. He secured a private parlor and a bedchamber in the most secluded wing of the establishment, demanding a fire be lit immediately and that no servant enter without his express leave. When he returned to the carriage to lift Elara, he found her eyes squeezed shut, her ink-smudged fingertips dug so deeply into the upholstery that the fabric groaned. He carried her through the bustling common room like a precious, fragile ledger containing the only truth in a world of lies. He felt the eyes of the travelers upon them, but his own expression remained as cold and unyielding as a granite cliff. He did not care for their curiosity. He only cared for the frantic thrumming of the heart against his ribs. The hallway of the inn felt too long, the flickering tallow candles too bright, but finally, the heavy oak door of their private parlor clicked shut behind them. The room was modest, smelling of beeswax and old timber, with a fire that began to hiss and crackle in the hearth. Arthur placed her in a wingback chair near the flames. The warmth was a physical presence, a counterpoint to the stagnant chill she had carried from her brother's house. He did not speak immediately. He understood that for a woman who had been gaslit into believing that every sound was a threat to her sanity, silence was the only sanctuary worth the name. He moved about the room with a measured, heavy step, drawing the heavy curtains tight against the night and checking the locks. He was building a new architecture for her, one built on the foundation of his own strength. He reached into his travel pack and retrieved a small object wrapped in a soft chamois cloth. It was a hand mirror, the frame made of just simple polished silver, unadorned and honest. He looked at it for a moment, remembering Julian's claim that the sight of a reflection would shatter Elara's mind. It was a lie designed to erase the self, to make a human being fear the very proof of their own existence. Arthur knelt on the hearthrug before her, the firelight casting long, flickering shadows across his rugged features. "Lady Elara," he said, his voice a low, resonant rumble that seemed to steady the very air. She did not look at him. Her gaze was fixed on her own lap, where her fingers continued their invisible arithmetic. In Blackwood Manor, the mirrors were draped in black silk cloths. "Your brother told you the glass was a danger. He told you that you were a fractured thing that could not bear to see itself." Arthur paused, his grey eyes searching her pale, hollowed face. "But Julian is a man who deals in shadows, and I am a man who deals in the balance of the account. The glass does not break the mind, it merely reflects the light." He held the mirror out, but he did not force it into her line of sight. He waited. The silence in the room held its breath. Elara's breath hitched, a small wounded sound. She slowly lifted her head, her dilated pupils reflecting the dancing orange flames of the hearth. Her gaze fell upon the silver object. To her, it looked like a weapon, a cold and terrifying piece of the outside world that had come to finish the destruction Julian had started. "I am not a doctor of the nerves," Arthur continued, his tone devoid of the sickly pity Silas Thorne had used. "I am a man who has seen the sun rise over 1,000 horizons. I have seen the sea reflect the heavens until the world was nothing but light. I tell you now, by the honor of my name, that the mirror cannot harm you. It is merely silver and sand. It is an honest room, Elara. It will show you only what is true." With a trembling that seemed to originate in her very bones, Elara reached out. Her fingers, marked by those lasting purple marks, brushed the cool silver of the frame. She recoiled for a second, as if expecting a blow, but when nothing happened, she leaned forward. She took the mirror from his hand. Her grip was so tight that her knuckles turned the color of bone. Slowly, with the agonizing hesitation of a prisoner approaching a window for the first time in years, she turned the glass toward her face. The gasp that escaped her was not one of terror, but of a profound, heart-breaking wonder. In the flickering firelight, she saw herself. She saw the hollows of her cheeks, the starkness of her brow, and the wide, haunted depths of her own eyes. She reached up with her free hand, her fingertips tracing the line of her jaw, then her lips, then the bridge of her nose. She was touching the physical reality of her own existence. She was not a ghost. She was not a collection of shattered fragments. She was a woman of flesh and blood, carved by sorrow but still entirely undeniably present. "I am here," she whispered. The words were the first she had spoken since the threshold of the manor, and they were thick with a sudden, overwhelming realization. "I have a face," Julian said. He said I had become a void, that there was nothing left to see. She began to cry then, not with the frantic sobbing of a breakdown, but with the quiet, cleansing rain of a drought finally broken. The mirror did not shatter her mind. It provided the first brick in the reconstruction of her soul. Arthur watched her, his own heart feeling a sudden, sharp ache of recognition. He had carried his personal tragedies like a heavy iron anchor for nearly a decade, a frozen state where he had almost forgotten the warmth of a living connection. Seeing her rediscover herself in the silvered glass was a moment of absolute vindication. He had been right to take her. He had been right to defy the polished cruelty of the Blackwood interest. He stayed where he was, a silent, protective presence in the firelight, allowing her to memorize the architecture of her own face. The storm of her initial realization eventually settled into a heavy, exhausted stillness. Arthur had ordered a tea service, and the smell of bergamot and wood smoke filled the small parlor, creating a sensory anger that felt far removed from the cloying lavender of her former prison. Elara sat back in the wingback chair, the hand mirror resting in her lap like a sacred relic. Her eyes tracked the steam rising from the porcelain cup, her brow furrowed as if she was solving a complex mathematical equation. "You mentioned a shipyard," Elara said, her voice stronger now, though still fragile. "Julian said the noise of such places would be like hammers against my skull. He said the world outside was a place of jagged edges and predatory sounds." She looked at Arthur, her eyes searching for the truth behind the bluntness of his features. Why would a man build a house in a place of such pain? Arthur poured a cup of tea, the liquid a dark, honest amber. He did not offer her a sugar cube. He knew she had been fed on sweetness and lies for too long. "My estate is on the coast, Lady Elara. It is a place where the wind does not ask permission to enter and the sea does not apologize for its strength. Yes, there is noise. There are the shouts of the shipwrights, the scream of the gulls, and the constant rhythmic thrum of the tide against the cliffs. But it is not a pain. It is a song of labor and of life." He leaned back, his grey eyes reflecting the dying embers of the fire. "Julian told you the air has teeth because he wanted you to stay in the mouth of his own silence. In his world, noise is a threat because noise requires response. It requires a person to be present, to be competent, and to be seen. At Sterling House, the sun does not burn. It is a creditor that demands you wake up and witness the day. The salt air does not scour the skin. It clears the lungs of the dust of stagnant rooms." Elara took a small, tentative sip of the tea. She noted the sharpness of the bergamot, a flavor so distinct and unmasked that it made her blink. "Julian said the light would blind me. He said my nerves were too thin to bear the weight of the sun." "The sun is the one honest room in the sky," Arthur countered, his voice firm. "It does not hide the weeds in the gravel or the black silk cloths on the mirrors. It shows the world exactly as it is." He thought of his shipyard, where the smell of cedar shavings and tar was a far more noble scent than the wax and ether of Dr. Thorne's bag. "You have been told that you are a glass bridge, Elara. But I have seen your ledgers. I have seen the purple ink on your fingers. A woman who can hold the arithmetic of a maritime debt in her head while the world is being stolen from her is not made of glass. She is made of iron that has merely been left to rust in the damp." He watched a flicker of intellectual spark return to her eyes, a small light appearing behind the grey fog of her trauma. She looked at her ink-stained fingers, then back at the Duke. "You speak of work as if it were a sanctuary. Work is the only thing that earns us the right to our own lives," Arthur said. "At my estate you will not find stopped clocks or shuttered windows. You will find a house that breathes with the rhythm of the ocean. You will find ledgers that are messy and shipyards that are loud, and you will find that you are the only person who can bring them to order. Julian wanted to keep you a child, Elara. I intend to treat you as a partner in the management of what is rightfully yours." He saw her spine straighten, a minute movement that spoke of a dormant dignity beginning to stir. She was not yet whole, and the journey ahead was still mapped with the scars of Julian's gaslighting. But the tea was warm, the mirror was honest, and the man across from her was as solid as a ship's anchor. Arthur Sterling had taken her home, and though he still did not fully grasp the extent of the psychological fortress she had inhabited, he knew that the salt air was coming. And for a woman who had been drowning in silence, the honest roar of the sea would be the only safety worth the name. He stood up, his tall frame casting a shadow that was no longer a threat but a shield. "We shall leave at dawn," he said. "The sun will rise and it will not burn you. I have balanced the account of this day, Lady Elara, and the debt of your fear is slowly paid in the currency of the truth." He looked at her one last time before retiring to his own quarters, noting that she did not recoil. She simply sat there, her fingers brushing the silver mirror, her mind beginning to calculate a future where the air did not have teeth but wings. Being seen by the right person was not the danger she had feared. It was the only safety she had ever truly known. The first day of travel away from the stifling confines of Blackwood Manor had been a blur of silence, a fragile passage through a world she had been taught to fear. The carriage had rolled past endless tracts of desolate moorland, the sky pressing down like a heavy iron lid. But as the heavy carriage crested the final rise of the northern road on the fourth evening, the twilight blooming into the color of a fading bruise, the world was beginning to scream. To Elara Blackwood, the muffled, velvet-draped prison of her former life had served as an intensive training ground for sensory deprivation. She had been conditioned to believe that the world beyond her shuttered windows was a place of jagged edges and predatory light. Julian Blackwood had whispered it into the very marrow of her bones for 3 long years, administering a slow-dripping poison of psychological erasure. He had suggested her very existence was too fragile for the open air. Now, as the coach descended toward the roadside inn that was to be their refuge for the night, the rhythmic grinding of the iron-rimmed wheels against the gravel sounded like the sharpening of a blade. Every jolt of the cabin against the uneven road sent a flare of panic through her chest. Her fingers dug so deeply into the velvet squabs that the dark violet ink stains upon her knuckles seemed to thrum with a life of their own. Arthur Sterling sat opposite her, his tall frame a steadying mast in the churning sea of her terror. He did not speak, but his presence was a constant, resonant weight, a counterpoint to the dissolving architecture of her mind. He noted the way her dilated pupils fixed upon the floorboards and how her lips moved in a silent, frantic recitation. She was counting the revolutions of the wheels, 2, 3, 5, 7, 11. The prime numbers built a frail lattice against her panic. She calculated the circumference of the iron rim, estimating the distance traveled by the rhythmic strike of metal against stone. It was a complex, elegant equation, one that required the full faculties of a mind Dr. Silas Thorne had declared irreparably broken. Mathematics was a sanctuary where Julian's gaslighting could not reach her. A number could not be manipulated by a false smile or a draped cloth. Numbers possessed an absolute integrity that people lacked. 7 years of grief could be measured. 3 years of isolation could be quantified. But the vast, unmeasured roaring of the outside world felt like an equation she could not yet balance. He smelled the salt air beginning to drift in from the coast, a sharp, bracing scent that cut through the stale lavender and wood smoke of the long journey. To Arthur, it was the smell of honesty and open horizons. In Elara's mind, it was the first evidence of the monster Julian had sworn would consume her the moment she stepped across the threshold of her family home. The carriage pulled into the yard of the inn with a clamor that made Elara flinch with the violence of a physical blow. The inn yard was a chaotic theater of movement and noise. Stable boys shouted over the clatter of iron horseshoes on cobblestone. A stray terrier barked frantically at the turning wheels, and the metallic clang of a dropped brass bucket echoed off the stone walls. These were not merely sounds. They were intrusions into a soul that had been kept in a state of sensory starvation for years. The sheer volume of existence threatened to crush her fragile equilibrium. Arthur watched her, his grey eyes shadowed with a grim understanding of the damage her brother had wrought upon her spirit. He did not offer empty platitudes or gentle, condescending whispers. Instead, he reached out and placed a large, calloused hand over hers. He did not seek to restrain her, but to provide a single, solid point of reference in the terrifying chaos of the evening. "We have reached the inn, Elara," Arthur said, his voice a deep rumble that managed to anchor her, even as the noise outside threatened to pull her under. "The noise you hear is not a threat. It is the sound of people going about their business. It is the arithmetic of a world that does not care for shadows." He stepped out first, then reached back to lift her from the coach. For a moment, she clung to the frame of the door, her breath coming in the thin, whistling gasps of a drowning person. The fading light of the twilight, though filtered through a thick layer of coastal mist, felt like a physical weight upon her skin. He carried her through the bustling common room, shielding her face against his chest so she would not have to confront the curious stares of the travelers. Arthur navigated the tavern with the effortless authority of a man accustomed to commanding quarterdecks in the teeth of a gale. The patrons instinctively parted for him. The inn was a place of honest, boisterous life, filled with the smell of roasting mutton, the steam from the laundry, and the sharp tang of fresh ale. To Elara, it was a cathedral of chaos. By the time they reached the private parlor Arthur had secured, she was trembling so violently that her teeth chattered in her head. He placed her in a high-backed chair near the hearth, where a small, cheerful fire was already beginning to take the chill from the room. Elara sat rigid in the scrubbed oak chair, her knuckles bone-white as they gripped the handle's silver-hand mirror Arthur had given her the previous evening. She had not let it go. It had become a talisman of her own reality, a solid weight she pressed against her palms whenever the phantom echoes of her brother's voice grew too loud. The parlor they now occupied was a simple, rustic space, smelling of dried herbs and wood ash, entirely devoid of the black silk cloths that had shrouded every reflective surface at Blackwood Manor. There was a large glass hanging above the mantelpiece, its surface clear and unashamed, but Elara kept her gaze anchored to the small silver oval resting in her lap. Julian had sworn that looking upon her own reflection would finally fracture her delicate mind, insisting she had become a hollow void, a phantom incapable of bearing the weight of sight. Yet, as she gazed down at the small looking-glass, the woman looking back possessed a stark, undeniable solidity. Her hair might have lost its luster, and her skin might hold the pallor of old parchment, but the dark ink upon her digits were a vivid testament to her survival. They were the physical proof of her secret rebellion, the undeniable evidence that she had been thinking, calculating, and existing even when she was told she was nothing. She tilted the silver glass slightly, catching the reflection of the dancing flames. The realization from the previous night had settled into her bones, forming a new foundation. She was not a void. She was a woman of flesh and bone, of ink and arithmetic, and she was fiercely guarding this newly reclaimed territory of her mind. She did not just look at the mirror. She began to apply her mind to the room itself. Her eyes catalogued the dimensions of the parlor, estimating the height of the ceiling and the structural integrity of the oak beams overhead. For years she had managed the household accounts in secret, auditing the ledgers Julian thought she was too fragile to comprehend. That same scrupulous intellect now turned its focus outward. She counted the number of floorboards, the spacing of the iron nails, and the precise geometric arrangement of the bricks in the hearth. It was an exercise in grounding herself. The physical world was real, measurable, and fundamentally solvent. The false arithmetic of her brother's gaslighting could not withstand the rigorous audit of her own senses. Arthur did not speak immediately. He allowed her the quiet dignity of holding the mirror, of tracing the lines of her own face until the violent trembling began to subside. The silence, it seemed, no longer had teeth. It was being filled by the sound of her own breathing, by the crackle of the fire, and by the steady, unyielding presence of the man before her. "The world is loud, Elara, because it is alive," Arthur said, his tone low and resonant. "And you are a part of that life. The sun will rise tomorrow, and we will continue our journey toward the coast. It will not burn you. It will only reveal what is already there." A young maid entered the room then, carrying a tray of tea and thick slices of buttered bread. She was a girl of perhaps 18, with rosy cheeks and a hurried, efficient manner that suggested she had no time for the dramatics of the gentry. She placed the tray on the small table between them, her keys rattling at her waist with a sound of cheerful competence. She looked at the violet ink on Elara's fingers and offered a quick, bright smile before ducking out of the room again. The scent of the tea, a heavy blend of bergamot and something earthy, filled the small parlor. Arthur poured a cup and handed it to her, his fingers brushing hers as the maritime debt ledger lay forgotten in his pocket. The warmth of the porcelain was a sensory anchor, a physical truth that Julian's whispers could not erase. Elara took a sip, the heat of the liquid spreading through her chest and thawing the ice that had gripped her for 3 long years. She looked toward the small table, where the maid had left a newly lit oil lamp. A broad, golden beam of light slanted across the scrubbed oak. The warmth reached her first. It was not a flame. It was a gentle, persistent kiss against her skin. She watched the way the dust motes danced in the lamplight, moving with a mathematical precision that her mind instinctively began to chart. She mapped the trajectory of the glowing particles, calculating the angle of the ambient glow and the radiant heat it projected against the wood. It formed a new geometry of existence, a tangible proof that the physical world operated on laws of physics, not on the malicious whims of her brother. Slowly, deliberately, she extended her arm, moving her tinted fingertips directly into the golden beam. She braced herself, waiting for the searing agony to begin. She waited for her skin to blister and her fragile mind to finally snap, precisely as Dr. Thorne had promised it would if she ever dared to touch the sun. "It does not burn," she whispered, her voice gaining a sudden, sharp clarity that startled even herself. She looked up at Arthur, her dilated pupils finally beginning to settle into a steady, intelligent focus. "Julian said the light would consume me. He said I was too fractured to be seen." She moved her hand further into the light, watching the way the fine hairs on her arm turned to strands of spun gold. "He lied about the light, Arthur. If he lied about the light, what else has he turned into a shadow?" Arthur stood up, his tall frame silhouetted against the ambient glow of the hearth. He saw the flicker of the intellectual spark returning to her eyes. It was the first brick in the reconstruction of the masterpiece Julian had tried to bury under silence and black silk. "Do not quote your brother to me," Arthur said, his tone low but carrying the absolute authority of the tide. "Julian deals in the currency of shadows, because shadows are the only place where a man of his smallness can feel like a giant. But I am taking you to a place where the air is honest and the light is a creditor that demands the truth. We shall stay here tonight to rest, and by tomorrow evening you will hear the roar of the sea. It is a song of labor and endurance, Elara. It is the sound of ships being built to withstand the very gales you fear. Elara took a bite of the thick, buttered bread, the flavor sharp, salty, and utterly unmasked. She chewed slowly, marveling at the simple, undeniable texture of the crust. It was food meant for travelers and laborers. Devoid of the delicate, tasteless refinement Julian had insisted was all her fragile constitution could handle. The rich, earthy taste of the butter grounded her further, a tactile reminder of her own physical body. She studied the silver hand mirror resting on her lap and then back at the golden pool of light. The architecture of her suppression was not yet fully dismantled. The corridors of her mind were still haunted by the echoes of her brother's voice and the clinical coldness of the manor. But the ledger of her life had been opened to a clean, bright page. For the first time in 3 years, she was not holding her breath. She realized, with a sudden, overwhelming sense of safety, that being seen by the right person was not the danger she had feared. It was the only sanctuary worth the name. Arthur stood by the window, observing the way the lamplight caught the violet ink upon her fingers. He had taken her from that silent, shuttered house, but he realized now that the true rescue was not a physical act of removal. It was a slow, scrupulous process of proving to her that she existed. He watched the methodical way she catalogued the room, recognizing the precise, calculating gaze of a fellow survivor. She was not a shattered porcelain doll requiring to be hidden in a velvet box. She was a woman who had used mathematics and violet ink to wage a silent, desperate war against her own erasure. Arthur knew the heavy burden of carrying a sorrower wearing a man's coat, having been cloaked in personal tragedy for nearly a decade. But watching Elara Blackwood defy the ghost of her brother's cruelty simply by drinking a cup of tea and touching a beam of light, he felt a profound shift in his own frozen heart. The great house on the coast, with its sprawling shipyards and boisterous servants, had been waiting for a mistress who understood the true cost of survival. The salt air was coming, and the debt of her silence was finally being paid in the currency of the truth. He would not leave her to the shadows ever again. He had balanced the account of this day, and for the first time in 7 years, Arthur Sterling felt the frozen state of his own grief beginning to thaw in the heat of her awakening. There was much work to be done, debts to settle and minds to heal. But for now, in this small room at the edge of the world, the air was clear and the coming night was an honest friend. The night stretched on, the rhythmic breathing of the old inn replacing the unnatural silence of her former prison. Elara dozed in a worn armchair by the hearth, refusing to surrender fully to sleep. She kept her marked hands tightly curled around the silver hand mirror Arthur had given her. The cool metal was her anchor, a physical reminder of the threshold she had crossed. She was no longer a phantom haunting Blackwood Manor. She was a woman of flesh and bone. The fire crackled, casting golden light across the timbered walls, a stark contrast to the shuttered twilight she had endured for 3 agonizing years. Every pop of burning wood was a testament to the vibrant world she was finally rejoining. By the time the grey light of a northern dawn bled through woolen curtains, Arthur Sterling was already moving with purposeful efficiency. He stood near the door, his thick maritime coat turned up against the chill. The room smelled faintly of bergamot and salt air, a scent that had quickly become synonymous with safety in Elara's recovering mind. Preparing to move their modest luggage to the carriage, his discerning gaze fell upon the battered cedar trunk Julian had allowed her to bring. It was a meager, insulting allotment for a woman whose personal dowry could have bought the entire inn twice over. Arthur gripped the leather handles, his calloused hands bearing the scars of years on the open ocean. Lifting the trunk to test its balance, he heard a peculiar dry sound emanate from deep within the cedar. It was not the soft thud of folded muslin, but a papery rustle like stiff parchment sliding against wood. Arthur paused instantly. In his demanding world of shipyards, an unexpected sound in the hold usually signaled a dangerous shift in the cargo. He had learned through bitter experience to never ignore the scrupulous arithmetic of a shifting weight. Numbers do not lie. People lie about them. He carried the trunk to the parlor table, setting it down with deliberate care. He worked the rusted iron latch, the metal giving way with a sharp click. Pushing aside a few unadorned dresses and a threadbare cloak that still smelled of the stagnant damp of Blackwood Manor, his fingers traced the interior lining. He pressed firmly on a slight irregularity in the grain, and a thin false board popped upward with a sharp snap that echoed in the quiet room. Tucked securely within the hidden compartment was a heavy bundle of envelopes tightly bound with faded violet ribbon. Arthur withdrew the packet, holding it up to the pale morning light. The handwriting sweeping across the parchment was elegant and fiercely precise. It perfectly matched the purple blemishes he had observed etched into Elara's fingers when she had audited his maritime ledgers the previous week. They were addressed to the few people left in England who possessed the legal authority and intellectual fortitude to challenge Julian Blackwood's tyrannical wardship. There were letters to an esteemed Cambridge mathematician regarding prime number theorems, and heavy envelopes directed to a scrupulous London solicitor, holding the unalterable deeds to her mother's dowry. Every letter had been systematically slit open, read by her captor, and cruelly resealed with a thick drop of the cold black wax Julian used for his correspondence. Arthur realized with ice-cold clarity the devastating depth of Julian's architecture of suppression. This was calculated psychological torture designed to dismantle a brilliant mind until nothing remained but a compliant shell. Julian had intentionally hidden these intercepted letters in the very trunk he permitted her to take away, wanting her to find them far from sanctuary. He had systematically severed her connection to the outside world, gaslighting her into believing she was entirely forgotten. Arthur heard the rustle of a linnebean gown and turned to find Elara standing behind him. Her grey eyes fell upon the thick bundle in his hands, and she went deathly still. The blood drained from her cheekbones, leaving her as pale as the winter frost on the window panes. She retreated into the only sanctuary Julian could never lock away, the precise architecture of mathematics. The prime number lattice. She obsessively counted the floorboards separating her from the table. 2, 3, 5, 7, 11. The prime numbers formed a geometric cage in her mind, a rigid structure of logic holding back the tide of panic. She calculated the exact circumference of the black wax seals against the rectangular geometry of the envelopes. Mathematics became her impenetrable armor, keeping her breathing when the air felt like crushed glass. "I thought they simply did not care to answer," Elara whispered, the words dragged across broken, jagged stones. "Julian told me, until it became my only truth, that a woman of shattered nerves was a profound embarrassment to a proud house. He told me that my father's old friends pitied me, but that a true man of logic could not correspond with a crumbling madwoman." She wrapped her arms tightly around her own ribs. "I wrote until my fingers bled, Arthur. I stole that violet ink drop by drop, hiding the vial beneath the loose oak floorboards. I wrote by moonlight when the black silk cloths covering the mirrors made the grand room feel like an inescapable mausoleum. I calculated the exact yields of our northern tenant farms, when no answers ever came. Year after relentless year, I believed I truly was nothing. The silence, it seemed, had teeth, and it was slowly eating me alive." Arthur stepped toward her, bridging the agonizing distance with an immovable presence. He refused to let the toxic silence of Blackwood Manor claim her brilliant mind ever again. "Your voice was never lost, Elara," he said, his tone striking the cool air with the ringing finality of a magistrate's gavel. "It was violently stolen from you. These letters are not a testament to your madness. They are the arithmetic of a crime." He placed the heavy bundle gently into her ink-stained hands. His warm, calloused fingers brushed her freezing skin, a silent vow of protection and intellectual parity. He remembered the maritime debt ledger and the wardship clause he had invoked to pull her from the shadows. Those documents had been his only weapons then, but these intercepted letters were undeniable proof of Julian's calculated fraud. "He did not silence you because you were constitutionally weak," Arthur continued, his grey eyes blazing with a suppressed, righteous fury. "He silenced you because your intellect was the greatest threat to his unearned power. You were never broken, you were simply too competent for his fragile vanity to endure." Elara looked down at the brutal black wax seals. The crushing sorrow that had worn her down for 3 years began to violently change, calcifying into something else entirely. Her thumb traced the arrogant stamp of the Blackwood crest on a broken seal. Mathematics provided an unassailable sanctuary, and this horrifying account showed that she had been perfectly solvent all along. Her mind had never failed her. Her logic had never been fractured by the light or the noise. She had not been forgotten by the world. She had been systematically buried alive by the very person legally tasked with her uncompromising protection. The realization permanently altered the atmosphere of the small chamber. Elara clutched the heavy bundle of letters to her chest as if they were the very breath she had been violently denied. The crushing shame began to lift, rapidly replaced by a cold, resonant indignation. The frozen state of her grief cracked wide open, making way for a clear-eyed wrath. She was a brilliant woman whose presence had been deliberately subtracted from the equation of her existence, and she was finally ready to brutally balance the account. Arthur watched the profound transformation with deep respect. He had endured a prolonged emotional winter for nearly a decade, a frozen state where he had almost forgotten the warmth of a true connection. But looking at Elara now, he saw a fellow survivor who had meticulously mapped the architecture of her own sanity while locked in the unforgiving dark. "We will keep them," Arthur said quietly, nodding toward the letters. "Every single one of them. We will preserve the wax and the ink. When the time comes to face your brother in the clear light of day, we will not offer him the unearned mercy of an emotional argument. We will offer him the inescapable mathematics of his own forgery." Elara slowly lifted her chin. The haunting emptiness in her grey eyes had vanished entirely, replaced by a sharp, intellectual fire that made the morning shadows retreat in utter defeat. "He told me the world was too loud for me to endure," she said, her voice finally steady, ringing with the absolute clarity of struck silver. "He told me the noise of common life would fracture my mind into 1,000 irreparable pieces. But he was only terrified of the noise I might make if I were ever allowed to speak the truth." "Then it is time to be loud, Elara," Arthur replied. A fierce, protective smile finally touched the firm corners of his mouth. "The carriage is ready below. The estate on the coast is waiting for its true mistress, and it is a boisterous place built for the living, not the dead. We will face the noise of the world together, and we will make them listen." Elara drew in a long, deep breath, tasting the faint traces of wood smoke and damp earth. It was the rich, unapologetic scent of survival. For 3 years, Blackwood Manor had held its breath, trapped in a state of suspended animation by a tyrant who feared the sunlight. But this inn, with its creaking floorboards and shouting ostlers in the yard below, was exhaling freely. She belonged to this vibrant, breathing world now. She left the silver hand mirror resting proudly on the scarred oak table. She no longer needed a fragile piece of glass to prove she existed in the world. The purple ink traces permanently etched upon her hands, and the heavy weight of her own truth, clutched against her heart, were proof enough. The carriage journey southward was a methodical unspooling of the miles separating her from the living world. The rhythmic clatter of iron-banded wheels became a comforting metronome. Whenever the unobstructed sky threatened to overwhelm her awakening senses, Elara retreated into her prime number lattice, anchoring herself in the unyielding logic of mathematics until her breathing steadied. She was an architect carefully surveying the newly expanded boundaries of her freedom. Arthur rode opposite her, offering a quiet, steadfast companionship that demanded absolutely nothing. The silence between them, unlike the oppressive stillness of Blackwood Manor, was warm and deeply solvent. It was the companionable quiet of 2 scarred survivors assessing the wreckage of their pasts and finding the foundation remarkably sound. Instead of plaguing her with pitying questions about Julian's cruelty or the false diagnoses of Dr. Thorne, Arthur spoke of practical, tangible things. He detailed the rigorous crop rotations required for the coastal soil, the staggering cost of timber, and the complex logistical arithmetic necessary to manage an estate supporting hundreds of families. He spoke to her as a peer, trusting her sharp intellect to grasp the immense weight of his ducal responsibilities. Elara listened with fierce concentration, her mind eagerly devouring the complex data. The agonizing stagnation of her 3-year confinement was washing away in the bracing salt air that began to filter through the carriage windows. By the late afternoon of the 4th day, the endless horizon of the sea broke upon them in a breathtaking surge of blue and silver. Elara leaned toward the window, her grey eyes widening as she beheld Arthur Sterling's coastal estate. It was a magnificent, sun-drenched shipyard manor carved directly into the rugged cliffside. The sprawling architecture was a brilliant symphony of golden stone, dark maritime timber, and soaring glass windows. Below the grand house, a vast network of bustling docks stretched out into the churning water. The air was thick with the rich, pungent scents of hot tar, wet canvas, and roasting mutton. The estate was gloriously, unapologetically loud. As the carriage rattled toward the main courtyard, the sheer volume of the world struck Elara like a physical blow. The shouting of dock workers hauling oak beams, the metallic ringing of the blacksmith's hammer, and the relentless crashing of the waves against the seawall merged into a deafening chorus. Julian had sworn that the chaos of the common world would plunge her into irreversible madness. Elara closed her eyes, her ink-dusted hands gripping the edge of the velvet seat. She summoned the prime number lattice, 2, 3, 5, 7. But as the numbers formed in her mind, she realized something profound. The noise outside the carriage was not chaotic at all. It possessed a distinct, undeniable rhythm. It was the industrious arithmetic of survival, the sound of a great living machine functioning with robust purpose. She did not need to hide from it, she wanted to understand it. The carriage jolted to a halt before the massive arched mahogany doors of the manor. Arthur stepped out first, the brisk sea wind catching his heavy coat as he turned to offer her his hand. Elara took it, stepping out of the carriage and into the full, unforgiving brilliance of the coastal afternoon. She did not flinch from the light. She stood tall, letting the fierce wind tear at her threadbare cloak, breathing in the scent of bergamot and salt air that anchored her to the present moment. Waiting upon the wide stone steps was a formidable figure who commanded the bustling courtyard with absolute authority. Mrs. Halloway, the stern and uncompromising housekeeper of the Sterling estate, stood with her spine rigidly straight. She wore a pristine dress of starched grey muslin, and a heavy ring of iron keys hung from her waist, clinking softly with her every measured movement. As Arthur led Elara up the steps, Mrs. Halloway's gaze swept over the young woman. The housekeeper noted the threadbare quality of Elara's cloak, the extreme pallor of her cheeks, and the undeniable violet ink stains permanently etched into her fingers. But crucially, Mrs. Halloway did not look at her with the condescending pity reserved for a shattered invalid. She looked at Elara with the shrewd, appraising respect of a general evaluating a new officer. "Welcome home, Your Grace," Mrs. Halloway said, her voice possessing the crisp, no-nonsense cadence of a well-kept ledger. She offered a precise curtsy to Arthur before turning her full attention to Elara. "And welcome to the coast, Lady Elara. Your chambers have been prepared in the south wing where the sunlight is most abundant. I trust the journey was not overly taxing." "The journey was entirely necessary, Mrs. Halloway," Elara replied, her voice steady and clear despite the roaring wind. She met the housekeeper's scrutinizing gaze with calm, intellectual parity. "I am quite ready to be done with the shadows. I understand this estate governs a vast number of shipyards and tenant farms. I imagine the ledgers required to maintain such an enterprise are formidable." Mrs. Halloway's stern expression softened by the barest fraction, a flicker of genuine approval lighting her dark eyes. In a world that often valued women solely for their decorative silence, a lady who immediately inquired about the estate's ledgers was a rare and valuable asset. "Formidable indeed, my lady," Mrs. Halloway agreed, a faint trace of dry humor warming her formal tone. "The Duke possesses many admirable qualities, but his paperwork is a tragedy of maritime proportions. If you possess a mind for numbers, you shall find no shortage of sanctuary here." Arthur smiled, the rare expression transforming his stoic features into something surprisingly warm and open. "Show her the house, Mrs. Halloway. Let her see that not every stone structure is built to function as a mausoleum." As Elara crossed the grand threshold and stepped into the sprawling entrance hall, the difference between this home and Blackwood Manor struck her with the force of a physical revelation. The walls were not draped in suffocating black silk. The massive windows were thrown wide open to the sea breeze, allowing the bright cleansing sunlight to pour across the polished oak floors. The estate was filled with the sounds of hurrying footsteps, the distant clatter of silver from the dining room, and the brisk, efficient exchange of orders. The estate stood paralyzed in expectant silence. Every tick of the grandfather clock sounded like a heart beating against a ribcage. The local magistrate had been summoned with a speed that spoke of Arthur's influence in the coastal district. He was a man of the law, his face as weathered as a sea stack and his eyes possessing a deep clarity. He sat at the heavy mahogany desk, the seal of his office resting upon a velvet cushion before him. Arthur stood by the window, the sea wind whistling through the casement. Elara entered the room last, her steps measured and slow. She was dressed in a gown of soft sea-green silk that Mrs. Halloway had provided, a color that seemed to draw the life back into her pale features. She did not look at her brother or the physician. Her gaze was fixed upon Arthur, seeking the anchor she had found in the darkness of the carriage. But as Julian began to speak, the old insidious whispers began to claw at the edges of her mind. She felt the teeth of the silence beginning to bite. "Sir," Julian said to the magistrate, his voice ringing with feigned sincerity, "my sister has been a victim of a tragic, nervous decline for 3 years. She cannot bear the light or the sound of a raised voice. She believes herself to be a shadow, and this duke has dragged her into this chaos against her will. Look at her fingers. The violet stains are the marks of her delusion, the frantic scribbling of a mind that has lost its grip on reality. I ask you to sign the order of reclamation and allow us to return her to the protection of Blackwood Manor." Elara felt the room beginning to tilt. The brilliant sunlight streaming through the library windows felt suddenly like a roaring flame. Julian's voice was a rhythmic poison, repeating the lies she had been trained to believe. "You are glass, you are a void." She summoned the prime number lattice, her mind desperately grasping for the certainty of arithmetic. 2, 3, 5, 7. She calculated the distance to the door and the number of panes in the window, but the numbers felt thin, a fraying rope in a rising gale. Dr. Thorne moved toward her, his black bag a dark weight. "Lady Elara, you are trembling. Your pulse is erratic. You are experiencing a violent sensory agitation, just as I predicted. The light is too bright, is it not? Come back to the darkness, child. Come back to the rooms where you are safe from the weight of your own existence." Arthur Sterling saw the flicker of terror in Elara's eyes. He saw the architecture of her soul beginning to buckle under the weight of the gaslighting. He did not move to comfort her. He knew that unearned pity would only confirm her brother's lie. Instead, he stepped to the center of the room and placed a heavy bundle of parchment upon the mahogany desk. It was the box of intercepted letters, the violet ink glowing with a fierce, undeniable integrity. "The physician speaks of hyperexcitation, but I speak of a mind that was systematically buried alive," Arthur declared, his voice cutting through the fog of Julian's whispers. "Magistrate, I ask you to examine these documents. They are not the frantic scribblings of a madwoman. They are the calculated audits of a brilliant intellect. These are letters Elara Blackwood wrote to the solicitors of her mother's dowry, and to the mathematicians of Cambridge. Every single one was intercepted, read and resealed with the black wax of Julian Blackwood. He did not cover the mirrors with silk to protect her nerves. He covered them so she would forget she was a human being with a right to her own name. Julian's face turned the color of damp slate. He moved to intercept the bundle, but the magistrate's heavy hand descended upon the letters first. The magistrate took up a magnifying glass, his eye tracing the sweep of the handwriting and the brutal wax seals. The room fell into a profound, expectant silence. Elara stood in the center of the light, her heart hammering. Her focus shifted to the official seal, a solid piece of silver that represented the absolute authority of the truth. These letters discussed the crop yields of the northern tenant farms with a precision that would shame a London auditor, the magistrate murmured, his voice resonant with mounting indignation. They discussed the prime number lattice with a clarity that I find quite humbling. Julian Blackwood, you have claimed your sister is a void, yet these papers show a woman who was running your estate from the shadows while you were pretending she did not exist. Julian did not lose his composure. He simply tightened his grip on his cane, his eyes fixed on Elara with a cold, unrelenting malice. She is a ward of the Blackwood interest. Her signature was obtained under the duress of her own delusion. These letters mean nothing in the face of a certified medical diagnosis. I have the law of wardship on my side. The law of wardship is not a license for the erasure of a soul, Arthur countered, his grey eyes flashing. The wardship clause I have invoked is primary. It supersedes your domestic claim because it is tied to the debt of the estate itself. You cannot reclaim a ward whose inheritance you have already attempted to consume. Magistrate, the evidence is before you. Financial arithmetic offers unyielding truth, and this account is heavily overdrawn with the currency of lies. The magistrate looked at Elara. He saw the violet ink stains on her fingers, the marks of a survivor who had waged a silent war against her own destruction. He saw the straightness of her spine, a dignity that had been suppressed but never broken. Lady Elara, your brother claims the world is too loud for you. He claims the light is a danger to your mind. I ask you now, do you wish to return to Blackwood Manor? Elara felt the weight of the question like a physical pressure. Julian's gaze was a tether, pulling her back toward the darkness. She heard the echo of Dr. Thorne's voice telling her she was a fractured thing. But then she looked at Arthur. She saw the salt air in his coat and the honesty of his eyes. She remembered the silver hand mirror and the way the light had felt against her skin. She remembered the prime numbers and the way the noise of the shipyard had transformed into a song of labor. She took a long, deep breath, tasting the scent of old books and sea wind. She realized that the silence no longer had teeth. It was an empty space that she was finally allowed to fill with her own voice. My brother told me the light would shatter me, Elara said, her voice clear and resonant. He told me the air had teeth and that my own face was a danger to my sanity. But the mirrors were not covered for my protection. They were covered so that I would never see the truth of what he was doing to my life. I am not a void. I am a woman of flesh and bone, and I am finally solvent. The magistrate did not hesitate. He brought the official seal down upon the final page of the wardship clause with a sound like a struck bell. The silver met the wax, and the debt of Elara's isolation was finally legally cancelled. The wardship is confirmed in the hands of the Duke of Stirling, the magistrate declared, his tone iron-hard. Julian Blackwood, you shall leave this estate immediately. If you attempt to contact your sister again, you shall find that the silence of a prison cell is far more profound than any you have manufactured in your manor. Julian turned without a word, his silhouette a dark, retreating line against the brilliance of the coastal afternoon. Dr. Thorne followed him, his black bag a redundant weight. They stepped into the medical carriage, the reinforced doors closing with a hollow thud. The vehicle turned and headed north, a funeral procession for a lie that had finally run out of shadows. The air in the library seemed to clear instantly, the stagnant lavender and ether washed away by the bracing roar of the sea. Arthur Stirling stood by the desk, his heart feeling a sudden expansion that he had not known in 7 long years. He looked at Elara and saw the masterpiece that was no longer buried in a cellar. He saw the architecture of a soul that had been rebuilt, brick by honest brick. The estate was no longer suffocating in fear. It was exhaling with the rhythm of the ocean, a sanctuary of noise and sunlight that recognized the worth of the woman standing in the center of the light. Elara moved toward the window, her stained fingertips brushing the heavy mahogany frame. She looked out at the shipyard, at the shipwrights hauling oak beams and the gulls screaming over the whitecaps. The noise was loud, and the sun was bright, and she was gloriously, undeniably alive. She realized that being seen by the right person was not the danger her brother had promised. It was the only safety she had ever truly known. The account of her life was finally in balance, and the future was a clean, unwritten ledger that she would navigate with a voice that was no longer a whisper. As the sun began to sink toward the horizon, painting the sea in gold and amber, Elara turned back to Arthur. The silence between them was no longer a prison. It was a companionable peace built on intellectual parity and a shared understanding of survival. The salt air was coming, and for the first time in 3 years, Elara Blackwood was not afraid of the wind. The black medical carriage remained in the center of the courtyard, a dark and unwelcome inkblot upon the sun-drenched gold of the Sterling estate. Julian Blackwood stood by the open door, his hand gripping the frame with a white-knuckled intensity that betrayed his internal collapse. Beside him, Silas Thorne looked less like a physician and more like a scavenger whose prize had been snatched away by a stronger predator. The shipyard workers had paused in their labors, their heavy hammers resting against leather aprons as they watched the drama unfold. The air was thick with the scent of hot tar and the bracing salt spray of the coastal sea. The silence that gripped the courtyard was not the stifling, artificial quiet of Blackwood Manor. It was the expectant stillness of a world waiting for a queen to speak her first decree. Elara Blackwood descended the wide stone steps, her sea-green silk gown whispering against the granite. She did not move with the hesitant, bird-like flinching of the woman who had first crossed the threshold of the roadside inn. Instead, she moved with a measured, arithmetic grace, her spine as straight as the masts of the great ships being built in the docks below. She bypassed Arthur Sterling, who stood like an iron sentinel at the base of the stairs, and walked directly into the center of the yard. She stopped before the great stone fountain, where the water leapt and fell in a rhythmic, geometric dance that mirrored the prime number lattice she had used to keep her mind whole during the years of dark isolation. She turned her gaze not toward her brother, but toward the gathered household and the men of the docks. She saw Mrs. Halloway standing at the periphery, her iron keys gleaming in the light like badges of office. She saw the magistrate, his official seal still held in his weathered hand, representing the law that Julian had so carefully subverted. Elara drew in a breath that was deep and honest, filling lungs that had been starved for years by the cloying dust of shuttered rooms and the heavy scent of black wax. When she spoke, her voice did not possess the forced whisper of a ghost. It was a clear, resonant bell that carried across the cobblestones. For 3 years, I was a prisoner in a house where the mirrors were covered in black silk cloths, Elara declared, her eyes sweeping over the crowd with an uncompromising clarity. My brother told me the light was a poison and that my own reflection would shatter my mind. He told the world I had become a void, a creature of broken nerves who could no longer bear the sound of a human voice. He used the language of medicine and the sanctuary of our family home to build a mausoleum for a woman who was still breathing. She walked toward the carriage, forcing Julian to meet her gaze. He flinched, the fastidious mask of his vanity finally cracking to reveal the hollow smallness beneath. He looked at her distinctively marked hands and saw not the marks of madness, but the tally of his own theft, the evidence of a mind that had refused to be extinguished. You did not cover the mirrors to protect me, Julian, she said, her tone devoid of malice but heavy with the weight of an inescapable audit. You covered them because you could not bear for me to see the competence in my own eyes. You were terrified that if I looked at my own face, I would realize I was the one who was solvent, and you were the debtor living on a stolen inheritance. You hid my letters and silenced my friends because your power required my non-existence. But the arithmetic of the soul cannot be cheated forever. The debt is called, and you are found entirely wanting. A murmur of righteous indignation rippled through the shipyard workers. These were men who understood the honesty of labor and the cost of a broken contract. They looked at Julian Blackwood and saw a man who had forged the ledger of a life. Julian tried to speak, his lips working in a silent, desperate protest, but he found no words that could survive in the brilliance of the coastal afternoon. He stumbled into the darkness of the medical carriage, Silas Thorne following him like a shadow retreating from the sun. The heavy door closed with a final echoing thud, a sound that marked the definitive end of the Blackwood suppression. The vehicle turned and headed toward the gates, the funereal black paint disappearing into the distance. Elara stood in the center of the courtyard, her sea-green skirts catching the wind. She observed the fountain, then peered up at the soaring glass windows of the Sterling Manor. The manor had finally ceased its terrified waiting. It was exhaling a song of industry and life, its broad stone chest expanding with the honest rhythm of the tide. Arthur Sterling stepped forward, the salt air in his heavy coat a familiar and grounding presence. He did not offer a hand to lead her back inside. He stood beside her as a partner, his grey eyes reflecting a profound and quiet reverence. He had worn his grief like weather for 7 years, a frozen state where he had almost forgotten the warmth of a true connection. Looking at Elara now, he saw a woman who had not merely survived the storm but had learned to navigate it with a voice that was no longer a whisper. "The ledgers are in the library, Lady Elara," Arthur said, his voice a low rumble that felt like the steadying beat of the tide. "I find the maritime accounts are currently a tragedy of disorganized arithmetic. They require a mind that is not afraid of the light. They require a mistress who knows how to balance the weight of the past against the promise of the future." Elara looked at him, and for the first time in 3 years, she did not calculate the distance to the nearest exit. Instead, she calculated the infinite possibilities of a life built on intellectual parity and shared respect. "I am quite ready for the work, Arthur," she replied. "I find that meticulous bookkeeping provides unparalleled clarity, and I intend to make this house the most solvent sanctuary in the kingdom." The late afternoon sun began to paint the rugged cliffs in shades of gold and burnt orange as Elara and Arthur walked toward the path that led to the summit. The shipyard below was still a cacophony of life, the rhythmic striking of hammers and the shouting of men creating a symphony of purposeful noise. Julian had promised her that such chaos would be the end of her sanity, but Elara found that the noise was merely the heartbeat of a world that refused to be still. It was the sound of ships being built to withstand the very gales that had once terrified her. They reached a clifftop bench carved from the same grey granite as the cliffs themselves. It was a place of wild beauty where the wind roared off the open ocean and the gulls screamed in a defiant soaring dance. Elara sat down, her sea-green silk gown spreading across the stone. She traced the golden path the sun was carving across the water. There were no black silk cloths here to hide the vastness of the world. There was only the light, the salt, and the enduring honesty of the water. Arthur sat beside her, his large, calloused hand resting on the bench between them. He thought of the 7 years he had spent in a state of stagnant mourning, his heart a frozen room where no one was allowed to enter. He looked at the woman beside him and felt the final shards of that ice melting away. "In 7 years, you are the first person who has looked at me and not seen a grave," he said, the admission thick with the gravity of a man who did not speak such things lightly. "You were the prisoner, Elara, but I suspect I was the one who was drowning in the silence." Elara reached out, her purple-tinted fingertips brushing the rough wool of his sleeve. The stains were permanent, a record of the war she had fought in the dark, but they no longer felt like marks of shame. They felt like the medals of a veteran who had reclaimed her own sovereignty. "The silence Julian manufactured had teeth," she murmured, her gaze fixed on the crashing waves below. "It was a silence designed to eat a person from the inside out until there was nothing left but the echo of a brother's lie. But the silence between us is different. It is a companionable peace. It is the silence of 2 people who have balanced the account and found that they are enough." She looked at the golden path the sun was carving across the water. "I used to count the floorboards in my room to keep the walls from collapsing," she continued, her voice gaining a resonant strength. "I used to calculate the circumference of the candles just to prove that time was still moving. I lived in an architecture of numbers because the architecture of my life had been dismantled. But now the numbers are not a cage. They are a map. I can see the geometry of the shipyard and the arithmetic of the tide, and I know exactly where I stand. I am a woman of flesh and bone, and I am finally home." Arthur watched the way the wind caught her chestnut hair, bringing the color back to her cheeks and the fire back to her eyes. He had taken her from Blackwood Manor, assuming she was a fragile creature requiring his protection. But he realized now that he had brought a storm of his own into the house. She was the mistress of the ledger, the architect of the soul, and the only person who could truly see the man behind the title of the Duke. "We shall build a new wing for the library," Arthur said, his mind already beginning to calculate the logistical requirements of a life lived in full sunlight. "We shall fill it with the books you were denied and the maps you were never allowed to see. The shipyard will continue to grow, and the tenant farms will thrive, and we will manage the account together. There will be noise, Elara. There will be the roar of the wind and the scream of the gulls and the honest shouts of the workers." "I should not want it any other way," Elara replied, a fierce and brilliant smile finally breaking across her face. "A house that is quiet is a house that is waiting to die. I have spent enough of my life in a mausoleum. I want a home that breathes. I want a life that is as loud and as honest as the sea." The sun began to dip below the horizon, painting the clouds in violent streaks of crimson and purple. The salt air was cold, but it no longer felt like a violation. It felt like a bracing kiss from a world that was finally calling her by her true name. Elara leaned her head against Arthur's shoulder, the bergamot and salt air of his coat a sensory anchor that promised a future of unyielding safety. The account of her isolation was closed, the debt of silence was paid in full, and the future was a clean, unwritten ledger that they would navigate with a voice that was no longer a whisper. The great house behind them glowed with the warmth of 100 candles, its windows wide open to the coming night. It was a sanctuary built not on shadows and shrouds, but on the enduring foundation of truth and intellectual parity. As the first stars began to appear in the darkening vault of the sky, Elara Blackwood realized that being seen by the right person was not the danger her brother had promised. It was the only safety worth the name. The silence, it seemed, no longer had teeth, it had wings. And as the tide came in, roaring against the cliffs with a sound like 1,000 struck bells, the estate was no longer frozen in unnatural stillness. It was exhaling a long, deep sigh of prosperity and peace. The lilacs in the garden caught the scent of the sea, and never before in the past 7 years had a single soul in that great coastal manor lived in the dark. The account was balanced, the storm was weathered, and Elara was finally, gloriously, solvent. Have you ever had a moment where someone looked past your tools or your plain dress and truly saw the architecture of your soul? I read every one of your stories by the fireside, and I wonder, which room in your heart is finally ready to breathe again? Let us discuss below.